We're going to try and get through this today. Part 2 of What Matters Now. We welcome the author of that book, Gary Hamel. You're very welcome back.
Pleasure, Aidan.
Great to have you back with us again. I'm going to open up this next section. So we're on chapter 3 for those who are reading along with us. And this is about the idea that adaptability matters now. Gary starts this by saying, we live in a world that seems to be all punctuation and no equilibrium, where the future is less and less an extrapolation of the past. Change is multifaceted, relentless, seditious, and occasionally shocking. Over to you, Gary.
Yeah, well, for sure. That is maybe the defining characteristic of our time, Aidan. I argue in this book, and of course, who knows what's really going to happen. But if you think 100 years, many 100 years from when people look back at this age, the last 30, 40 years, the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, this new millennium, like what is going to strike them, right? We had the Enlightenment, we had the Dark Ages, we had the birth of Christianity. There's a lot of amazing historical things. But what will people look at this age? And I think certainly part of it is going to be we had an inflection point in the pace of change. For most of human history, you assume that you're going to live much like your parents, your grandparents. And of course, that started to change for sure in the Industrial Revolution. Without a doubt, change has gone hypercritical in our lifetimes. Certainly, there are a lot of things that hit a significant inflection point over the last 20, 30 years. We're both the authors and the victims of all of that change. But it is stressing us hugely as individuals. Technology is reshaping the way we live and even our brains faster than we can really think about. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? How might we regulate this a little bit better than we have? But it also is just changing a lot faster than our institutions can change, let alone us as individuals. And so, the defining characteristic of our age, I sometimes call it the age of upheaval, where the future is less and less an extrapolation of the past. So, how do we learn to thrive, survive in that kind of world is a lot of what I talk about in What Matters Now. But also, I come back to that theme in later books because I think it's the biggest challenge most institutions face. And as I say, it's not only corporations, it's governments, it's religion, it's, it's social structures like the family. All of these things are kind of up for grabs.
There's a beautiful little paragraph you give here, and it really nails the thing home. So you say, just reflect for a moment on the recent history of mobile phones and how Motorola hatched the industry in 1983 with its brick-shaped Dynatac phone, and then seemed invincible until a decade later when Nokia surprised the industry. You worked with them, let's remind our audience as well, with their Candy Bar phone. And by the end of the century, Nokia's far-fetching designs and torrid expansion had given the Finnish company 40% share of what was now an enormous market. And then in 2002, Canadian company RIM, Research in Motion, introduced the iconic BlackBerry. And then in 2007, Apple rocked the industry once again. 4 leaders in 4 decades. And that's the reality of a competition in a world where change is shaken rather than stirred.
Yeah, and you see the same thing in social media, where you went from Friendster, MySpace, to Facebook, to now TikTok, right? Every few years. And it doesn't, the important thing here is, often these changes, it doesn't mean that the old companies kind of die instantly. They just kind of lose their relevance and their pace and shrink into the background. There's certain industries where the pace is much slower. If you look at the airline industry, hugely capital intensive, highly regulated, it is consolidated substantially around the world. You don't see quite that pace. But there again, over the last couple of decades, you saw Southwest come and then kind of become dominant, and maybe now less so. Ryanair, AirAsia, and wherever you go in the world, you see all of these new super low-cost discount carriers taking market share. So as we talk about this, Aidan, we're going to kind of struggle to find exemplars because there's not many companies that have built this capacity for continuous reinvention. I remember one CEO telling me, hey, my company is growing like a rocket. And I said, have you noticed that rockets follow a parabolic curve? And, the satellites they launch into space ultimately come back to Earth in pieces. So the mark of success is not simply whether you can grow a business, but whether you can reinvent it over time. And, that's, as I say, that's true of even society's deepest institutions. In the book, I talk about a really interesting experience I had now, maybe a couple of decades ago, where I was asked to talk to 7,000 church pastors. And I can tell you that was an interesting experience to be with 7,000 people who are probably more virtuous than I am. Well, probably not all of them, but most of them. And, if you look in Europe, if you look in the United States and you see, kind of organized religion slowly losing its place in society, my argument was the problem is not probably even religion, it's the organized part of that. And when you look at the data, people still have an immense spiritual hunger. Most people still believe in some kind of divine power in the world, but churches have simply lost their relevance. And the way we do church has changed very little in a few generations. Maybe the music gets a little better. I don't know if the preaching gets any better. And, this is said in the fact, and I think we mentioned this before, that every generation is growing up in a new world that is shaping their values, their beliefs, their experiences, their relationships in a way that makes it super hard for older people to understand. And if you have a group of older folks running an institution and you're trying to make that relevant, super hard to do. So I think the starting point for me, and one of the starting points in all of this, is to be really careful to distinguish between what are your values and what are your habits. And what are some fundamental truths about human beings or faith or about consumers? What are those fundamental truths versus what are mere tradition? And when you elevate tradition into that kind of, give it primacy, like you're going to lose. And I think particularly administrators, bureaucrats, kind of professionally trained managers, if you come into a successful company, it's very easy to mistake momentum for thrust. So it feels like, it's kind of like when you send a rocket into space, you have this huge amount of thrust. And even after you turn off the boosters, it will continue to accelerate for some time, right? Before it kind of runs out of that. So you can feel like, hey, we're growing, we're winning new customers. If you look at the current trajectory of success, you're growing, maybe getting market share, bringing new things to market. How long ago were the critical decisions made that generated that thrust, that generated that momentum, right? Often you find that those critical decisions were made 5, 10, 15 years ago. And are we doing anything right now to regenerate that momentum versus simply sitting on the rocket, riding it into space and go like, wow, what a ride. We need to talk a little bit about that and how you develop a certain kind of honesty about where are we, how sustainable is this thing, what's the imperative to reinvest and build the future? Because when all the indicators are in green, like it's easy to believe like it's going to be that way forever.
One of the problems for me reading is when I'm reading, I go down all these rabbit holes and I start writing an article here and there. And one of them was inspired by this idea, how does excellence expire? And you talk about three forces at work. The first is gravity wins. The second is the law of large numbers. And then there's the law of averages and the law of diminishing returns. And I was thinking about how it's the same, it's that whole Ernest Hemingway quote, how did you go bankrupt first slowly, then quickly? I thought about how does a dad bod form on your body? When I had kids, it was like chicken nugget here, a little bit of chips there. And the next thing you're like going, wow, my trousers don't fit me anymore. And it's the exact same thing that, as you said, it's the habits. And if you have a higher value that cancels out those habits, you'll adhere to the values, not the habits. But I'd love you to take us through those three things.
Yeah, we go a little deeper there because, I've always been curious, Aidan, that among senior executives and among investors and analysts, we don't have a very disciplined way of thinking about strategy decay, right? So if you believe, as I do, that, every strategy has a life cycle, they don't last forever. Some are longer, some are shorter. How do you get early warning signs when a strategy, a business model is losing its dynamism? And it's surprising how often the knot takes people by surprise, right? I spent a lot of time as well with some of my colleagues thinking about why is it that strategies run out of road and how do you become alert to that? I think there's several things that we can talk about. First of all, I think there's 3 or 4. One is, as you said, gravity wins. You can put an airplane up for a while, but it's going to run out of fuel eventually and gravity wins. And that happens in several ways. First, there's the law of large numbers. as a business gets bigger, it just becomes harder to grow at the same rate, right? It's much harder to grow a $40 billion company by 10% than a $4 million company by 10%. It's kind of, the place where Apple is now. You're so huge and so valuable. Like, how do you keep growing? There's also kind of the law of averages that obviously in the long run, there are no high growth companies, right? If there was a super growing company over the long run, it becomes the whole economy. So we just know that over time, things revert to the mean. And then you have the law of diminishing returns, where whatever strategy you have is going to lose its effectiveness over time. And what that means practically is you will have to put more and more resources into achieving smaller and smaller gains. Like you have to spend more and more to acquire another customer, for example. Or like in the case of semiconductors, like every time we have the size of the device and we go from 20 nanometers to 10 to 5 to 3, like you've got an exponential rise in the cost of that. So these things, you can't really reverse these, but there are ways you can deal with them by breaking big units into small units. I think of Vinci, the French infrastructure company that has thousands of small kind of micro businesses, very entrepreneurial. And because monolithic things just don't grow fast. That's true in nature. You kind of break big units into smaller units where those smaller units maybe have more upsides and can imagine where else I can grow. I think you ensure that every unit still has a very challenging growth target. Jack Welch did this at GE. He asked every business unit to redefine their served markets so they had less than 10% market share. So that's, I think, a good, because it forces you to kind of extend your horizon and think bigger. Hire does the same thing with their leading targets where they challenge businesses to grow at 3 or 4, 10 times the industry growth rates. Getting a lot better at reallocating resources from slower growing to faster growing things so you don't overinvest in legacy. Having the courage to abandon slower growth businesses. This is what IBM did many years ago when they got out of the PC business. They invented that basically, but then said, that's a mature business. And ensuring that you never conceptually tie your company to one business model. There's things you can do to kind of stay in flight, even though gravity is omnipresent.
The Indian guru, Sadhguru, the guy, he does all talks. He's like an influencer online and he does big seminars and stuff like that. He has a great story. And essentially what it boils down to is that gold crushes ants. And the whole idea that if you give the ant a piece of gold, it'll crush it. If you try to throw money at it, it often can kill it because it makes you devoid of imagination or the struggle. And in the struggle is where you actually find things. And this is something that's often overlooked with innovation, that you need people hungry. You need them to think outside the box.
Yeah, I think poverty in some sense is a spur for innovation, right? I mean, you look at people who overcome enormous poverty, and that poverty, you can either just accept it or it could be a spur to get an education and to strive and to work hard and so on. And there's sometimes, obviously, when there's nothing you can do to overcome your situation. But certainly, kind of wealth is not a spur for creativity or innovation. As we've argued before, innovation is always born in this gap between aspirations and resources. So I think the second thing, Aidan, so first, like gravity wins, and you can kind of, look at any business and kind of think about where are we with that? What could we do? I suggested some of the things you could do. I think the second thing, as I say, is just recognizing that strategies die. And not only do they die in very predictable ways. If you look at how human beings, how we die, I think if you go through that list, it's probably heart disease number 1, cancer number 2, stroke number 3, whatever those things are. But it's not like a surprise. There are things you can do around diet and anti-inflammation and so on. So same thing. I talk in the book about the 4 primary ways in which strategies die. If there's another one, I'd love for one of our viewers to maybe think about that and say, hey, there's something else I think you might be missing. But one of those is over time, strategies get replicated. Like people watching, they're like, well, that's a good idea. Let's do that. In fact, let's even do that slightly better than you did it. So I think about, in the UK, there are now like any number of big coffee chains, Costa Coffee, Cafe Nero, Greg's. And I don't know whether Starbucks was a latecomer in the UK or not, but clearly Starbucks is not at all unique in terms of having a nice place to get a coffee. Or, You think of how quickly Samsung and then later, Xiaomi and Huawei and so on, how quickly they replicated the iPhone. It's like amazing breakthrough with completely different form factor and touch sensitive screen. I think it was probably within 2 years, 3 at max, that Samsung had a very, very similar device. American Airlines invents the customer loyalty program. Now everybody has those. So there's just a diffusion process that you can look at. And so like new ideas just don't stay new for very long anymore. And I think the followers catch up a lot quicker than they used to. This is the idea of disruptive innovation. But secondly, good strategies get superseded by better strategies. So you have somebody who looks at a particular functionality, particular customer benefits, and say, I think we can deliver that in a new way. Most of us now, you could just watch the slow decline of international phone call revenues because we were all using voice over IP, right? We were all using some other way. I was talking to my friends in the UK yesterday, and of course they call me over WhatsApp, or you look at how home theaters have decimated the cinema business. Someone's going to say, hey, there's a simpler, better way of doing this. I think also strategies over time just get exhausted. This is a little bit that idea of diminishing returns, where they just kind of reach their natural limits. You started out by talking about the mobile phone business. Well, the mobile phone business is a mature business. If you look over the last decade at Apple's market share, it's hardly changed at all. And so maybe you can go for some time by raising the price, but there's probably a limit to that. So they just kind of reach their natural limits. I look at what's happened in luxury goods. We can come back because it's quite an interesting story, actually. But, they just raise their prices way faster than inflation. A Chanel bag is maybe 2 times inflation adjusted what it was a decade ago. And you're like, okay, how long can you just do that? And then finally, strategies get eviscerated often by customers who just hollow out your profits. They get better information. They can become smarter buyers and so on. So what do you do about all of that? I think you have to be alert to strategy decay. And that means avoiding the tendency to explain away things that are not going so well. So when you see slowing revenue growth, declining margins, a growing number of new entrants, declining asset productivity, shrinking PE ratio, greater customer churn, rather than going like, well, that's temporary or whatever, like go behind that and really think hard and ask, which of these things, are people copying us? Are there just better ways of doing this? Are we losing our pricing power to powerful customers? Just be honest about it. But I think strategy decay should never be a surprise, ever. There's always indicators, and yet, the capacity for denial often means that, but takes a change in leadership before somebody says, all right, let's just admit the truth. I think we talked about the Microsoft when Satya Nadella took over. Was it 2013, something around then? Wasn't that long ago? I think it was. Took over. He finally was able to admit that we can't be the PC company anymore. The world's just moved on. My earlier point about being willing to spin off or downgrade legacy businesses. When Satya Nadella essentially blew up the Windows business as it was then, like he said, that's just not our future anymore. It's hard to imagine the prior leadership doing that. And yet you have to have the courage to do it. Otherwise, have the legacy as an anchor. No excuse, but still interesting how often it seems to take companies by surprise.
I'm sure, like many of our listeners, I worked through that. And as you say, it's so predictable. And what's so annoying is you have like a Chicken Little saying the sky's falling down. That's how I used to kind of see myself. But you're incredulous to the denial around you. And then what's worse is some of the people who are actually where the power lies have a vested interest in the status quo. They start to use some of your lingo or your new way of thinking. And then they try to erode it and bring it in under their cover and actually cannibalize the future for you right in front of your eyes. And you're just looking around going, where's the candid camera? And it's so annoying when this happens. And, you talked about strategic decay. There's so many people inside companies who can see it clearly, but they have no voice or they have no power because they're usually in charge of a budding new revenue stream that isn't yet important enough. And therefore they get killed or they leave frustrated.
Yeah, exactly right, Aidan. The traditional power structures give a disproportionate share of voice and power to people who are vested in the past. And we can come back and talk about how you change that. But let me give you a third way, because again, what you want to do in any institution, whether you're running a university or a public utility or a small business, you really want to be, you want to be alert to the way excellence expires. And I think there's a couple more ways that are so, gravity wins for sure. But I think there's another one that success corrupts. And, I often used to say either success is a self-correcting phenomenon. And, nothing fails like success. And when you kind of dig into that, you're like, well, why should that happen? Why does success so often seem to be this brief period in between mediocrity or in between failure? And you look at it closely and you see several things. I mean, first of all, as a business grows and maybe the leaders, the builders kind of leave and you get a new generation in, you kind of shift from playing offense to playing defense. And you get big enough, and I don't think this is primarily a problem of investors, by the way, but you get big enough or you're successful enough where you start to feel you have more to lose from challenging the status quo than from actually challenging it. And so the gestalt shifts from being builders to being custodians. So that's one. I think number two, in the quest to kind of optimize what you have, and you become kind of over-optimized. And it can make it super, super difficult to change things. And so, again, this is more conceptual than maybe practical. I'm not sure I could tell you how to translate this practice. I think oftentimes you'll see a business making decisions for the sake of efficiency where they're trading away units of adaptability. Let me give you kind of a current example. I've seen this for the last 15 years, but now it seems to have finally struck home. The fact that Apple was so dependent on China for its manufacturing. It was easy to be in that partnership with Foxconn, whoever it is that they work with there, to put more and more of their assets in China. It's already there. We understand it. We have good partners and so on. But you're also trading away units of adaptability if something happens to the Chinese economy or political and so on. And Apple is saying, how do we move production elsewhere to India or wherever it may be? But when you make decisions for the sake of efficiency or short term, a leadership team needs to ask itself, are we making ourselves less flexible? Are we surrendering flexibility here or units of flexibility? And if so, is this really worth it? You just continue to optimize without thinking about where am I creating a lock-in or a lack of exitability. A third thing in how success corrupts that we've talked about a lot, it fossilizes our thinking. And it kind of inflates our egos. Like, hey, I'm so smart. We saw this thing. We did it. That must make us geniuses. No, maybe you're just lucky. You were right place at the right time. But that's never going to be the explanation. No, we had brilliant foresight. We're so smart. We understand this. I think we also talked about a fourth way that success corrupts, which is as you accumulate resources, there's a danger that resources start to substitute for creativity. We'll just spend more on R&D, or we can spend more on marketing or whatever it may be. But that's a really dangerous thing when the thing is, we can win simply by outspending the other guy. Well, yeah, maybe for a while. You have to look at those things and kind of be honest. Like, do we really feel like are we more on defense? Is our instinct to protect what we have? Are we trading away our flexibility? Do I find myself defending rather than challenging old thinking? So you got to be, again, I think the secret, Aidan, is just like, don't personalize this. These are just realities of what success does to us, right? It makes us a little arrogant. It makes us a little dogmatic. It tends to make us myopic. It can make us kind of timid because so much is fake. Like, just be honest about that. Don't take that as a personal thing. Say, this is like, this is what success does to organizations and to people. And therefore, what am I going to do about it? And there are a couple of things you can do about it. One is, listen for language in your organization where the language evokes or illustrates that kind of protective, defensive, dogmatic kind of way of thinking. And I give a bunch of examples. So like when somebody says, hey, we can't afford to screw it up, you want to say, yeah, but you can't afford to play it safe either, right? So like, what do we do? Or when somebody says, hey, our competitors wish they had our resources, yeah, but they're probably glad they don't have our overhead, right? So that comes with it. Or when somebody says like, this is how our industry works, you go like, Yeah, until it doesn't. Or, hey, we're the biggest. Yeah, well, so is the Titanic. So I think be alert for things that get said that kind of are making us numb to what's changing in the world or are making us seem like invincible in some way. And then as a leader at whatever level, make sure that you're making it safe for people to dissent. And, I think humility is an enormous competitive advantage. If you have an abundance of that, you are not going to be surprised by the future.
I know you live part-time in the UK because you lecture there, and there's a great quote by the great British band Radiohead, and they've reinvented themselves time and time again, embraced the internet, gave the album away for free, all this kind of thing. But the lead singer, Tom York, is a great saying. He says, as soon as you have any type of success, you disappear up your own arse. Like, tell it as it is, Tom. Tell it as it is. But you made me think, and I want to connect the dots for those people who have been joining us all the way, and so many have because they've left comments here and there that I'll say something at the end and they'll connect the dots and they say, I listened to all the way through. But one of the great gifts you gave me across the series was that idea of the lack of resource or the frugality leading to brilliant invention. Like, I often think of immigrants in new countries, for example, but you taught me about the idea of, Vietnam and how the Vietnamese built those bridges just below river level that couldn't be seen because of the guerrilla tactics, because they had no choice. And I thought that just wanted to bring that back to people's mind. When somebody may get a new job and they're paid more, and then they overstretch, they buy a new house, they buy a new car, it's on hire purchase, they don't really own it, all these kind of things. And then the tide comes in and they're caught naked. And I think you see this with so many companies. We see it right now. So many really successful companies, they have a market share, there's a shift in the environment, less of their products are desirable, and then they let go of swathes of people from the organization that they've trained, people who know the culture, etc. And then the market recovers a little bit, and then they try and hire them back, and people are like, going, I ain't joining you. We saw it during COVID, for example. But that mindset, I just don't get how you can't be agile, because you talked about the importance of strategic agility.
Well, I think at the bottom of all of this, as I was just saying, Aidan, there are a set of human foibles, as you were kind of also saying there. There's the arrogance that, like, I'm smart and we know what we're doing, and so you lose the humility. There's the kind of dogma, and there's only one way of doing this. Myopia over time. I mean, I see this again and again. When I'm in business school environments or university environments, the only people they pay attention to are other universities that look like them. It's like, guys, the threat is not going to come from that, but the threat is already coming. You can see the demand for university degrees is going down. There's a lot of education online. There are a lot of employers now who are more interested in, like, what can you actually do and what are your skills than, like, did you get some kind of a diploma? But you're not going to see that if all your attention is on how you're competing with a university that kind of looks like yours. Success narrows our vision. But I also think we underinvest in the time that is necessary to understand what's changing in the world. And that's kind of the last way that strategies erode. I talked about gravity wins, strategies die in some particular ways, success corrupts, but also, like, shift happens, right? I mean, that's where we started the conversation. We're in this world where there's just enormous, and external change can erode success either quickly or slowly. But slowly is just as dangerous, maybe more dangerous, because you get a trend that just is kind of creeping along and goes unrecognized, and people don't pay much attention to it. Let me give an example. If you look at the rise of Donald Trump, nobody could foresee, Trump as a particular individual, but you could foresee the likelihood that somebody might come with a populist point of view. So if you look literally over the last 20 or 30 years in the U.S., and to a lesser extent in Europe, what you saw was greater wealth disparities. You saw medium wages stagnant. You saw culture shifting in fast ways that were making people very anxious. Somebody's going to take advantage of that. And so in my own country, here in the United States, people are like, how did the Republican Party, the party of business and so on, and it is, how do they end up becoming the champions of the working class? And that's what polls show, that working class people are more likely to see the Republican Party as kind of their ally. Well, these are all very slow things, right? There was nothing surprising going on there, but the Democrat Party largely didn't pay attention to it. They're out on the stump talking about the oligarchs. So the problem is not really the oligarchs. The problem is that the bottom 50% just lost out. And those changes are particularly difficult to see when they're challenging your self-definition. So if you're the Democratic Party and we're supposed to be the party of the working class, and what you see is a whole set of things that are eroding the economic success of the working class and hard things to get your mind around and a change. Well, what can we actually do about that? Let's just let it go. I talked a few minutes ago about the fashion industry. It's been very interesting to see what's happening now. It's in quite deep crisis. I think some brands like LVMH and Burberry and so on are way down. There's a few that have hung on and done pretty well. 10 years ago, I did a presentation. I won't tell you for who, but I did a presentation for somebody in the fashion industry. Little Lily, this is 2015. And I said, think about what may happen here. Will increasing income disparities make people less inclined to broadcast their wealth through all their brands? And that's happened. We've had this move to quiet fashion or subtle fashion away from logos and so on. Is there a likelihood that the definition of luxury changes? That it's no longer about heritage and craftsmanship, but it's much more around technology and innovation, a brand or the fact that it has innovation and so on. What might peer-to-peer markets do? A huge explosion in used market for luxury handbags and other things. That was clear that was going to happen. What will happen if millennials and Gen Z put more attention on experiences over products? And what happens if China goes ex-growth? And if the CPC cracks down on conspicuous displays of wealth, or the China property market, which is creating a sense of prosperity, collapses? But if you're paying attention, you understand those are all potential shifts starting to bubble away that could be super threatening to you. And I would love to go back and look at these big companies, Gucci, Kering Group, LVMH, whatever they are, and ask 10 years ago in the boardroom or an executive suite, were you guys talking about these things? Were you collecting data on these things? Were you go let's be sure we're watching what's going on? I doubt it. So, again, as I've argued in other broadcasts, it's usually not that the future is entirely unpredictable, but it often goes unnoticed.
To your point, the board members often just sit there listening to a scorecard instead of using their expertise as board members. They're usually very experienced. They've run companies, hopefully entrepreneurial in some way, and they have a point of view, but often they just receive a scorecard. I always think the board should be used in a what can you see that we don't see type arrangement. And oftentimes, when some board member goes, hey, I'm not happy about the way the industry's going, they mention some of the trends you saw there, they'll get back a report the next board, and it's just brushed under the carpet and everything goes back to normal.
I couldn't agree more. I think one of the primary values of the board is to speak truth, to speak uncomfortable truths, and to be relentless at honing in on kind of vulnerabilities that are kind of on the periphery right now. But yeah, I would agree. It also means I think that you got to have younger boards. If the average age of your board is late 50s, early 60s, that's already a problem. Unless they're quite exceptional people, that's just not going to be super helpful to understanding some of these emerging things. We started talking about how do you buy insurance against irrelevance, if you like, or how do you future-proof an organization? You take measures to disaggregate the organization and to slough off the things that are slower growth. You carefully track strategy decay rates, invest a lot of time in understanding what are these emerging trends and what vulnerabilities do they create and how do we offset those as early as we can or leverage them in some way. And then how are we honest about our own human proclivities and how they can make us vulnerable? If I'm a CEO, I'd almost say, Aidan, these should be posted behind the head of every kind of leader in their cubicle, their office, wherever they sit. So anybody comes in to have a meeting, these are behind the CEO, and it's what the CEO needs to ask, right? Please tell me. And it would be where was I wrong in the past? what do you think I'm missing here? What other options do you see? What would our fiercest critics say? What would you do if this was your business? What would we do if we had a clean sheet of paper and no legacy? What if risk was no object? And so you have to be very purposeful about asking these questions, because Aidan, we've talked about this, with those power asymmetries, people are super nervous to be honest about concerns and vulnerabilities and what's going wrong, right? You're super reluctant to kind of upset the apple cart. So as a leader, I have to go way out of my way to de-risk honesty, to de-risk criticism. In many organizations, people learn fairly early on that there are few rewards for challenging the assumptions, the beliefs of the people they report to.
But we may remember this ad. I don't know if it was on when you were in the UK, and it's probably 20 years ago. It was an ad for Yoplait, the yogurt company, and they had this brand called Petit Filou, this little taster brand. Anyway, there's a King's Taster. And I always think of this as exactly what happens in an organization. He's tasting and he really likes it. And the King's like looking, kind of going, can I have some? And he goes, hey mate, you have an apple. And the King bites the apple and dies. And I always think of what actually happens in organizations is you have that taster. And it's like, oh, you can't bring that to Garrett. He won't like that. And that's, again, this has happened to me, where some people have it in them, even if they know they'll probably suffer they'll shoot the messenger at the end. They'll know they'll suffer from that problem, but they still have to get it out of themselves. But this happens all the time. You have this layer that protects the leader from the truth, when the leader, as to your point, needs that so badly, but these layers just stop it all the time. And I never understand why they're allowed to do that. And surely the leader knows about that.
No, I think it's a super good point. And I see this absolutely a lot. It could be a recent example. I'm going to have to disguise it a little bit, but I was trying to talk somebody in a university a layer or two down from the provost, the president, and so on. I was trying to talk them into doing something new. And they said, well, we need to find a precedent in our policies or our programs where we've done this before. And I go, that's useful, but maybe this is a place where we need to break it. But their implicit assumption is I can't propose anything that is not anchored in some way in the past. I'm not criticizing that person because their assumption is our leaders just won't go for it, right? Now, that may well be valid, right? They've seen a lot of things shot down. But often they're wrong, because often a leader has a lot of pressure on them. They know they need to innovate, they need to grow and whatever. And the people below them are filtering out anything that's bold and radical on the premise that, like, okay, maybe our leaders won't like this. And so, again, as a leader, I got to tell those guys, I need you to bring me the crazy shit. I need you to bring me the stuff that you think is going to make my head explode, right? That is the real risk, that there are layers and layers of filtering going on. And that by the time I see something, it is so anodyne, so predictable, so incremental that there's no chance that it's going to make a real difference. But yeah, at every level, there's that self-filtering. Now, of course, the other way you deal with that is you create ways of starting experiments and getting things done and building some momentum before anything goes up, the pyramid. Certainly when we're like helping companies in innovation and we're creating idea markets and trying to get a bunch of new ideas out, in every case, I want the first review to be peer review. So not people who are at the top, but peer review. And number two, I want that idea to have the chance to have some degree of experimentation and work on it before it gets exposed, right? Rather than taking something, I think we talked maybe about Intuit, this American kind of financial software company has been like amazingly successful over a very long period of time. And the chairman, maybe now emeritus chairman Scott Cook, he said, I do not want to see PowerPoint slides or pro formas or plans. I want to see data. Go out and try something and see if it works, and then share what you're learning. And what that ensures is that somebody has the time and the space to try something before somebody else says, like, that'll never work. Now, there's some things that you can probably, if a bunch of people look and say, like, that's never going to work. Okay, fine. But, oftentimes people just self-censor. The number of times I've heard, like, people go and say, that's not us. Well, we understand why. And maybe it should be. But there's this whole definition of who we are and who we aren't. And, when you hear people say like that again, like, be super, super careful. Okay, why are we just like preemptively ruling that out of court?
There's a beautiful little piece you say here. I have to quote it because it's beautifully written and it's just a great mental model for people to get their heads around. It's your farmer versus rancher analogy. So I'll give it a little quote here, then you might want to riff on it, maybe modernize it for today. Managers too often see themselves as farmers. They've been given a plot of ground to cultivate a business or market segment, and their goal is to grow the biggest possible crops of profits. Over time, though, yields fall as the soil becomes more saline, markets saturate, or as vital nutrients are depleted, differentiation wanes. By now, though, the VP is in love with his 40 acres, so he responds by spending even more on fertilizer, marketing, and digs deeper and more expensive wells, raising capital investment even as ROI declines. It would be better if managers saw themselves as ranchers whose grass-fed herds were always on the move. A rancher's loyalty isn't to a piece of ground or even a particular animal. When a pasture gets grazed out, you move on, you move the herd on. When an animal falls behind, it gets culled, and over time, the entire herd gets replaced as older animals go off to slaughter and new calves get born.
Well, again, yeah, I think kind of the deeper truth there, and obviously even our own bodies, like all of our cells get replaced over time, right? You are not at all who you were 7 years ago, like in any respect. But there are things obviously that provide continuity. So I think it's this sense that it's this ability to think about a business as this like dynamic, kind of living, ever-changing thing rather than static. And I think practically there are two elements to that. I think there are two things that end up like kind of getting a business marooned, right? One of those is that you just don't have enough new strategic options. So if you do not, when you look at the future, if you see the future as more threat than opportunity, you will be defensive, right? You'll hang on to what you have. But if you've had a process, if you have a way of constantly generating hundreds, or I would argue thousands of new strategic options, then the future is always, doing something new is always more exciting and potentially more profitable than hanging on to the status quo. I think Clay Christian and some other people, the innovator's dilemma, I think in some senses it was wrong. I mean, in some senses it was right. Yes, companies are slow to embrace new things. But I don't think it's correct to say that the new things are always cannibalistic. They're not. Often these new markets are bigger than the ones that they replace. And so it's not like, it's a matter of when we start to move and whether we can be positioned for that. But if you don't see those new opportunities, and I think I used this analogy before, it's the bird in the hand versus all the birds in the bush. So if the bush is empty and all I have is this poor dying little thing in my hand and the feathers are coming off, right? But damn it, this is my bird. Like, I'm never going to give up this bird. So I think you have to have a process that is creating a portfolio of opportunities so the future and change is always more enticing than the status quo. Now, that doesn't mean you give up all of the status quo, right? This is not about just like, let's abandon stuff that works, but it's understanding where you need to do that. I think the second thing, most companies lack that portfolio of new options. They have a very linear planning process. It's all about just financial planning and incremental. They do not have a process for generating compelling new strategic options. Second thing is, politically, in many organizations, it's very difficult to shift resources from old things to new things. Because the resource allocation process is dominated by the big people who are running the legacy businesses. And they're always going to tell you, and rightfully so, they're going to tell you, hey, the best way of using a marginal, pound, dollar, euro is to invest it in something we're already doing. That's the lowest risk. For sure, it's just not the biggest upside, right? and you kind of overinvest in what is at the expense of what could be. You see another problem in that in most companies, if you have a new idea, there's only one place to go for funding, and that's up the chain of command. And so if you have to go up for 4 or 5 levels, and at each level, somebody can say no without consequence, what's the chance anything new is ever going to be done? Right? So you have to change that resource allocation process. But there's a strategic challenge, which is creating enough new ideas. And then there's and I would argue it's primarily a political challenge, which is taking resources from the haves and giving them to the have-nots. If you think about what government does, the heart of politics is making choices about where resources go, right? The tax money, the priorities, and so on. And in governments, often you have these legacy programs not very effective. They go after year after year after year because there's a constituency behind them and they're connected politically. And nobody really knows this is what DOGE has been trying to do in the United States. Nobody's evaluating their effectiveness, and they just run because they have constituents and powerful friends. So, building a resilient organization, you've got to deal with the cognitive challenge, the strategic challenge, and then the political challenge of reallocating resources and not letting that process be controlled by people whose primary impetus is to protect what they have.
Beautiful. Beautiful, Gary. I think we'll leave it there. There's a very little small book. I highly recommend a little tiny little book. It's also available as a HBO article, actually. It's called Strategic Intent, and it was written by Gary with his friend C.K. Prahalad, may rest in peace. I thought we'd cover that, if that's all right with you, next, and then we'll move to humanocracy. But there's a piece I love at the very end, and I think it's why I do this work. I love sharing work like this because I read about this Bill Gore, and you talked about in the book that you were interviewing Terry Kelly, who was the CEO of Gore at the time, and she shared that Bill Gore spent a lot of time thinking about the human element of business, and he was influenced hugely by Douglas McGregor's book, The Human Side of Enterprise, and that changed how he did business. And I thought about in the world that we live in today with so many people time poor in the knowledge economy, that if somebody listens to this or reads it and just changes it a little bit, changes the lens, that they can have a huge change in their business. And I hope that is the case, and I'm very grateful for you for giving up your time for people to do that. So with that, Gary, where's the best place for people to find you if they want to reach out, if they're interested in keynotes, in work as a consultant? Where's the best place?
LinkedIn is a good place to find me, and I check that fairly regularly. Anybody can write me an email. It's really simple, Gary@GaryHamel.com. We try to respond to those. I'm on X at Prof. Hamel. So, yeah, and then website, GaryHamel.com. There's ways to get to me there. So I try to be super attentive to people who have questions, want to know more, need more resources. This is not my profession. This is my passion. So, yeah, I'd encourage people to reach out if they so desire.
And I can vouch for him because that's how I found him as well. Gary Hamel, thank you for joining us.
A pleasure, Aidan, as always.